What if I told you the gold-backed bank that Muammar Gaddafi was killed for is finally becoming a reality? Not in Libya, but through his ideological sons, military leaders from the AES Bloc. These aren't just soldiers. They are the continuation of Gaddafi's unfinished rebellion. And this time, they're doing it quietly. Building the financial institutions of liberation without asking the West for permission. 3 African nations just built their own banks quietly without asking the IMF, France, or anyone else. No news coverage, no outside funding, no approvals, just silence and a bold new financial weapon. But what exactly did they create, and why is the West avoiding the conversation, but working behind the scenes to eliminate them silently? Let's find out. Something monumental just happened in West Africa in a low, key declaration that hardly made the news. At first glance, the establishment of a new financial organization by 3 landlocked nations appeared to be a straightforward regional endeavor. But if you look a little closer, you see that this wasn't your typical situation. This was the kind of breakaway that shakes the foundations of established systems. Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, nations that are frequently reduced to statistics concerning insurgency, coups, and poverty, have just taken a risk. They established their own regional bank. The Confederate Bank for Investment and Development is the name of the organization. Don't be fooled by the bureaucratic nomenclature, though. This is not some innocuous government agency. This uprising is expressed in money. A bank with a single goal to finance the future without meddling supervision or Western funds. It began with 500 billion CFA francs, all between 820 and 833 million. A substantial sum of money by any measure, but particularly for nations that were told they couldn't finance anything without outside assistance. Until recently. The money is no longer coming from Brussels, Washington, or Paris. It originates inside their respective economies, inside their reserves, inside their local networks. It's African currency intended for African growth. This bank's existence alone isn't what makes it so disruptive. It's the cause and the location of it. These are not Africa's economic superpowers. These nations are in the Sahel, caught in geopolitical turmoil, deserted by international allies, and subjected to sanctions. Nevertheless, they have accomplished something that experts claimed was impossible, in spite of the pandemonium. They are taking charge of their economic future by subtly constructing the instruments of sovereignty rather than by demonstrating in public places. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was not ostentatious. No international dignitaries at the gala. Investors were not the target audience for the launch. It was not an aesthetic issue. It had to do with intent. This type of desire indicates that something more significant is happening. These nations are no longer in need of assistance. They're saying they don't require it. And they're doing it with deeds, not words. Free nations that were formerly a part of the Francophone West African economic system, linked to the French-backed CFA currency and intricately involved in organizations such as ECOWAS and the West African Economic and Monetary Union, would be served by the Confederate Bank. However, since 2023, these same nations have begun to reorganize their relationships, expelled French soldiers, and withdrawn from AES. As a result, when they claim to have constructed a bank, it's not just a bank. Rather, it's the last phase of their exit strategy, an indication that they won't be returning. This is when the narrative becomes even more disturbing for everyone watching. Not for them. This was more than a reaction to loneliness. The escalation was planned. Following economic pressure, political exclusion, and sanctions, these countries took an uncommon step in global politics. They ceased to respond and began to construct. They did not respond with diplomatic outrage or threats. In response, they produced something. Material that increases their independence, decreases their vulnerability, a quiet revolution, and one Gaddafi, no doubt, would have recognized instantly, and makes them more difficult to manipulate. You must consider what this bank replaces in order to comprehend the scope of what is taking place. For many years, donor-backed initiatives run by non-governmental organizations and foreign contractors. as well as organizations like the World Bank and the African Development Bank, have shaped the region's growth. These collaborations often required ceding authority, changing regulations, and agreeing to scrutiny by those in charge of the finances. That script is reversed by the Confederate Bank. It returns decision-making and funding to the local community. Furthermore, this move isn't symbolic. It is designed to finance actual projects, infrastructure, industrial growth, and agriculture. Sectoral areas that the IMF is consistently too slow to support and too fast to politicize. You don't have to establish your creditworthiness to a Western economist who has never stepped foot in a Sahelian village. When you work with this bank, there's no need to fulfill growth goals formulated in boardrooms abroad. The only prerequisite is that the initiative benefits the local community, rather than international investors. The West's lack of response to this action says a lot. There is no media frenzy, no expert committees questioning how this would impact the stability of the region, and no retaliation. It seems as though the only remaining tactic is to act as though it never happened. Because recognizing this bank is recognizing something far riskier than a simple financial transaction. It entails recognizing Africa's capacity to develop its own systems, that the three coup nations are capable of planning, coordinating, and taking the lead. Therefore, the Confederate Bank enters the scene quietly and defiantly, rather than with much fanfare. It's not ostentatious. It doesn't want to make headlines. However, it is designed to endure, and more significantly, to expand. The question now is, why did they do this? You need to look beyond the numbers to see why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger established this bank. Ambition was not the source. Exhaustion gave birth to it. Something finally broke. After decades of waiting, cooperating, and conforming to development partners' expectations. Not in outrage or protest, but in clarity. These countries didn't decide to establish a bank overnight. They came to a conclusion that few others have dared to express as, there has always been a rig in the game. The Sahelian people were told for years that foreign help would bring them salvation. Every new government was expected to shake hands with beaming diplomats who managed the aid flow, pursue reform packages, and demonstrate its allegiance to foreign financiers. It started to happen frequently. A tiresome, embarrassing ritual. Although leaders changed, the regulations remained. Sign, borrow, and act as though it's helpful. What did they receive in exchange? Airports that never got going. Roads that didn't lead anywhere. Initiatives that terminated quietly after ribbon cuttings for the headlines. The appearance of development was sufficient, but not for the people. The reality is that a large portion of this aid was intended to maintain dependence, not end it. Something that Western governments and international banks hardly ever acknowledge. They ceded their policy space in return for loans. They gave contracts to foreign companies in return for assistance. They saw their sovereignty erode in the name of cooperation. They were instructed to wait each time they requested agricultural investment. They were told it was too dangerous each time they suggested local industry. However, the money came in every time a multinational corporation sought access to their uranium, cotton, or gold. That's not mismanagement. That's exactly the dependency Gaddafi warned Africa about. That system is operating precisely as intended. Additionally, these nations have had enough. For this reason, their decision to construct their bank was emotional as well as strategic. The goal was to restore the dignity that had been damaged by years of financial dependence. We're no longer asking. It was about conveying a message. They do not oppose progress. They are turning away from the developmental paradigm that initially caused their dependence. However, this uprising has a deeper dimension than just financial. The world rejected the Sahel States Alliance, AES, as a defensive pact, when these three nations founded it in 2023 after being suspended from ECOWAS. They needed something to stay afloat. However, desperation did not give rise to the AES. Clarity gave birth to it. Africa can no longer afford to be tactful about its pain. According to this political, cultural, and intellectual alignment, that is what binds Captain Traoré, Gobanta, and Chiani together. They control narratives in addition to ruling nations, narratives that defy filtering by donor-funded media outlets or Western focus groups. They have said unequivocally that their revolutions are psychological as much as military. Their goal is to convince their people that the days of constantly looking out are over, and that waiting is no longer necessary. Therefore, in the Western sense, this bank is not a financial entity. It resembles a machine that tells a counter-narrative. It rewires the concept of development. These leaders are deciding to demonstrate its value to their own people rather than to international investors. They're creating mechanisms that enable day-to-day living to go on without begging, rather than adjusting GDP to improve credit ratings. But don't get me wrong, this was more than simply internal annoyance. A trigger was present. The mask came off when France withdrew its troops, imposed sanctions, and stopped providing aid as a result of their refusal to adhere to democratic standards. These countries realized then that their friendship with the West was not unconditional, that the assistance ceased as soon as they disobeyed. And then something came up that altered everything. Were we ever genuinely sovereign if they could cut us off so easily? At that point, the bank's concept became a line in the sand rather than a side project. Additionally, this promise held true throughout time, in contrast to many other post-colonial ones that did not, because it was based on memories rather than ideology. The recollection of how their currencies were manipulated, their economies plundered, and their futures secured by beaming technical specialists and diplomats. They're remembering, not paranoid. They did, in fact, construct a bank. They actually constructed a wall, though, a barrier between their future and those in charge of it in the past. And that wall suddenly appears dangerous from the outside, since it is not a threat to progress or peace, but to the whole system that ensured these countries never had the means to dream without authorization. They stopped dreaming under other people's roofs and constructed the bank. This is precisely what Muammar Gaddafi envisioned when he pushed for a sovereign African financial system. It's no longer a dream, it's being built by his ideological heirs in AES. However, what would this bank do in reality? Thus, they constructed it as a guide for the future as much as a rejection of the past. It's hardly a vanity project, though. This is not a revolutionary monument. Money, materials, machinery, and brains are all intended to be moved by the Confederate Bank for investment and development. It's not here to make an impression. It is here to make the necessary repairs that no one else would. The West discussed infrastructure investment for years. However, there are still potholes and dusty roads connecting these three nations. The only thing that changed was the consultants and their findings. Even though the World Bank would announce multi-million-dollar railway projects, the Confederate Bank is now filling the void left by broken promises. What's its top priority? Rewiring the bones of the area. We are referring to rail lines that link the uranium hubs in Niger with the industries in Mali, and then to the distribution centers in Burkina Faso. Not to ports for export, nor to Europe, but to one another. For that is the distinction. This has nothing to do with exporting raw commodities to make money abroad. The goal is to create internal networks that support local labor and industry. The only viable routes for many years were those that led resources out of Africa. The goal of the Confederate Bank is to reverse the trend, to connect miners to energy resources, farmers to processors, and goods to local markets. It's the logistics of liberation. However, steel won't be enough to drive this change. Energy will be the future battlefield. The Confederate Bank is supporting a different future in an area dominated by imported gasoline prices and ravaged by blackouts. Energy grids that are locally maintained, decentralized and renewable. The strategy: large-scale solar farm investments, particularly in areas with the highest levels of energy poverty and sunshine. These mega projects are not foreign-built and do not need IMF oversight. Residents of the area are funding these community-powered microgrids, because schools remain open as long as the lights remain on. Refrigerators are operated by clinics. Local companies no longer rely on diesel. Development suddenly becomes a reality. However, energy is just one component of the chain. The other is food. The Confederate Bank is getting ready to make a significant foray into the food processing and agricultural industries through national distribution centers, village-owned companies and local cooperatives, rather than international agribusinesses. In its simplicity, the objective is radical eat what they grow, and grow what they eat. These nations have depended on imported wheat, rice, and processed commodities for far too long, even though they had more than enough soil to flourish. Why? Because funding for food self-sufficiency was discouraged by the aid system. Importing was usually less expensive, not because the land was unproductive, but rather because local farmers were left with machetes and draughts, while foreign food came with subsidies. That formula is being reversed by the Confederate Bank. Farmers now have access to the full chain: equipment, irrigation, storage, and processing. They no longer sell tomatoes for pennies while purchasing tomato paste in cans from Europe. It's not charity. This is agricultural sovereignty. Additionally, it has been constructed one hamlet, one tool, and one crop at a time. Then there are the heavens. Indeed, colonization has even spread to the skies. International airlines have controlled regional travel in West Africa for many years. It's a cruel joke. It is frequently necessary to travel through Europe in order to fly from one African nation to another. Now it is different. A regional airline that operates direct flights from Bamako to Niamey to Ouagadougou, free of layovers, visa restrictions, and legacy carrier price gouging, is being established by the Confederate Bank. The goal is to establish an aviation corridor that promotes regional trade, tourism, and education, all of which are vital to regional integration, but have never been profitable to international investors. However, it is more profound, because movement isn't the only aspect of integration. It has to do with trust. Furthermore, money has never trusted the frontiers of Africa. For this reason, the bank is creating digital platforms and interoperable payment systems that let people and companies send and receive money and carry out cross-border transactions without the need for euros or dollars. And that, too, was Gaddafi's vision. An Africa whose movement, trade, and money are not routed through foreign capitals. It was once dismissed, but now, quietly, it's being built. No more depending on the French-backed CFA system. No more exorbitant costs just to send money from Mali to Niger, unrestricted by colonial currency systems. The Confederate Bank is paving the way for genuine trade. Let's be clear, two idealists do not operate this bank. Those who run it are strategists. Every loan, project, and investment is made with consideration for national interest, long-term return, and risk management. They have observed debt traps. They've read the fine print. And they've learned that free money usually comes with invisible handcuffs. This time, they're the ones setting the terms. No, they don't have billions. Not yet. But what they do have is intent, astute, well-organized, and independently funded. Every dollar invested is meant to solve the kinds of problems no foreign partner has ever prioritized. Because when your hands are finally on the wheel, you drive in a different direction. Catching up to the West is not the goal here. The goal is to build what the West never intended to offer. You could analyze financial statements, project budgets, capital reserves, and balance sheets at the Confederate Bank, but only if you think like an economist. If you look again, you'll notice it's not built like a bank at all. It's built like a spine, a network, a fortress, because beneath the paperwork and loan programs lies a far more ambitious mission: unification with purpose. Not merely for profit, not just for politics, but for the survival and sovereignty of people. Development isn't the only goal here. The goal is to bind the three nations to a common future, one that no outsider can break. Africa's story has long been one of manufactured disunity, engineered so thoroughly that borders, languages, currencies, and even time zones were divided by colonial whim. Fragmentation ensured dependence. Railroads don't link countries that share waterways. Nations that speak the same language trade in foreign tongues. Neighbors who should collaborate are tied to different donors, different predators, and different agendas. That wasn't an accident. It was a blueprint. one designed to keep West African nations vulnerable to each other's weaknesses and dependent on foreign capital. The Confederate Bank is tearing through that wall, not with treaties or summits, but with concrete investments. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are joining their economies and securing their futures together, through fiber optics, through collaborative ventures, through independent digital systems, not a handshake infrastructure. This bank doesn't just lend to nations, it funds a bloc. And that matters, because you are no longer three isolated, vulnerable states. Once your development plans, energy grids, transport systems, and food networks are in sync, you become a single, coordinated unit. The Confederate Bank is the financial engine of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, which functions on that exact principal. Vision becomes infrastructure. It's what turns ideas into roads. It's what transforms slogans into supply chains, statements into spreadsheets, and spreadsheets into everyday commerce between once divided communities. In fact, put the bank aside for a moment. If you want to grasp the gravity of what's unfolding, just observe what it replaces. For years, regional integration meant ECOWAS, a bloc that looked powerful on paper but in reality was paralyzed, built on a colonial currency, still tethered to the euro. Dominated by larger countries like Nigeria and aligned with Western policy, smaller nations had to plead with ECOWAS for flexibility for years. In return, they received nothing but bureaucracy. But ECOWAS didn't act like a brotherhood when the Sahelian military governments made decisions that the West disapproved of. Decisions like expelling foreign troops, rejecting exploitative contracts, and exposing blatant hypocrisy. No, it acted like a police force: suspensions, sanctions, border closures, isolation. So when the Sahel nations broke away and formed AES, they weren't rejecting unity. They were redefining it. Integration wasn't being dismantled. It was being rebuilt on their terms. And today, AES is far more than just a political alliance. Thanks to the Confederate Bank at its center, it's a functioning system with shared economic regulations, a unified budget, and a coordinated currency strategy. They are drafting customs agreements. They are building joint procurement systems. They are proposing a common market for essential goods and services, all managed, executed, and safeguarded by the bank. And here's where it becomes powerful, because unity isn't just tactical, it's defensive. Alone, these nations were exposed to coups, to sanctions, to economic sabotage. But together, they are far harder to destabilize, far harder to isolate. No more single points of failure. No more weaponizing the weakness of one state to dismantle the others. When Burkina Faso was cut off from aid, Mali stepped in. When Niger was sanctioned, AES partners opened alternative trade routes. And now, they no longer have to justify themselves to uncooperative lenders. Because they have a regional bank, they're no longer forced to restructure their economies every time a Western institution updates its governance standards. They've built a closed-loop system, based not on secrecy, but on self-determination. And the gateway into that system is the bank itself. If you want access to the opportunities, capital, and markets inside this bloc, you abide by AES rules, not Washington's, not Paris's, and not Brussels. The roles have been reversed. For the first time, African nations are building the framework, and outsiders must now decide whether they're willing to join on Africa's terms. This isn't just a policy shift, it's a posture shift. The Confederate Bank is not merely a financial institution, it's a political instrument. A new tool for assertion, not reaction. For designing reality, not just responding to it. And the world is starting to notice. What happens when Guinea applies to join AES? When Chad turns to the Confederate Bank for funding? What happens when a so-called minor alliance achieves what the AU couldn't accomplish in decades? This is no longer a local experiment. This is a continental prototype, and it's working. So tell us, do you still think African nations need help? Do you still believe full independence is out of reach? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Here on Black Rebellion, we uncover the untold stories of Black existence, Black rebellion, and Black untold history. Subscribe to join the movement. By doing so, you're not just staying informed. you're becoming part of a global push to reclaim Africa's rightful place in the world. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's spread knowledge and build sovereignty together. Thanks for watching.